When she was still in the orphanage, Elizabeth decided she was going to have a big family, many children, 3 little ones at least, and she and her husband would love them and they would never abandon them as they had abandoned her. Once, Elizabeth didn't even know who her parents were. She was literally left on the street in the park. An old lady noticed a child wrapped in a sheet. It was already autumn and chilly. The woman took the child to a shelter. It turned out to be not far away. That's how Elizabeth ended up there, as she spent her entire childhood there. After graduation, Elizabeth went to work. School's expensive, can't help it. And every day, you want to eat and dress nice too. She decided to put off school until later. In the meantime, Elizabeth got a job as a waitress in a cafe. The pay was good, she had enough, and there were a lot of good-looking young men who came in. Elizabeth liked one of them, tall, handsome in a suit, and he looked at Elizabeth a lot. Emma's partner noticed that too. "You don't get lost, friend," she winked at Elizabeth. "He obviously likes you." "I don't know, I'm not his type," said Elizabeth doubtfully. "What if it works? Smile at him, maybe he'll ask you out on the date." The girl took her friend's advice and smiled at him as she served coffee. She looked into his eyes, and his eyes were very beautiful, black like embers, and he immediately reacted. "Elizabeth, what are you doing after work today?" he asked with a smile. "Nothing," Elizabeth replied, "sitting at home." "Can I ask you out on the date?" "Say, 10 p.m. I'm just getting off at 11 o'clock. Elizabeth had already decided that nothing was going to work out. "Well, that's good," the guy exclaimed. "All week, I've been waiting for you outside the cafe. You're welcome to go for a romantic moonlight stroll. By the way, my name is Thomas." "I'm Elizabeth," the girl said, embarrassed. "I've known that for a long time," laughed Thomas. "Well, do you agree?" "I agree," Elizabeth exhaled. That night, they took a long walk. They just talked and laughed. Elizabeth was easy with Thomas. They didn't even feel any difference in social status. Although Thomas, at 25, was already the head of a department at a large company, he didn't pay much attention to where Elizabeth worked. It was clear that he really liked the girl, and Elizabeth fell in love at first sight. When Thomas invited her home to introduce her to his mother, the girl was happy. So, it was serious. But there was a surprise waiting in Thomas's apartment. In the hallway, a little girl ran out to meet them. "Daddy," the girl cried out joyfully and held out her hand to Thomas. He picked her up, laughing, and kissed her on the cheek. "This is my daughter, Katie," Thomas said with a smile. "The daughter? Where's her mother?" Elizabeth felt cheated. Now the wife's coming out too. "Why did you bring me here?" Elizabeth thought to herself. "Katie's mom eloped," Thomas replied simply. "We didn't even get married, we were going to, but something kept getting in the way. Then Evelyn got pregnant. We decided to get married after she had the baby so the bride wouldn't have a pregnant belly. And she gave birth and left me. Katie, she ran away. I turned out not to be the man of her dreams. She waited all the time for a prince." "Well, aren't you a prince?" smiled Elizabeth. "You're my best prince, and the child is not a hindrance to us, honey." "How glad I am to hear that," Thomas admitted. He hugged and kissed the girl. Katie stood beside him, looking at the strange woman. Although she was confused, Elizabeth was not the least bit frightened. The girl knelt down and stroked the little girl's head. "Hi, honey," she smiled at the girl. "Daddy didn't tell me anything about you. I'll bring you a doll tomorrow. Now here's a chocolate bar." Elizabeth took a sweet treat out of her purse, and from the room, Thomas's mother was looking at them. Lydia liked her son's new girlfriend. She was nice, kind. Thomas was obviously fond of her, and she made friends with her granddaughter right away. "Honey, I'm very glad we met," Lydia said at the end of the evening. And I'm glad too, Elizabeth smiled cheerfully. That's how Elizabeth won the Thomas family over. 6 months later, they were married. That's it, Elizabeth. Now you're going to live your life without denying yourself anything, Emma told her after the wedding. The husband is rich, the apartment is big, it's all right to have a baby. You'll have your own soon, you'll probably leave the cafe now, won't you? No, not yet, Elizabeth replied. I can't live on this money, and we haven't talked about it. That's right, Emma agreed, and Thomas makes a lot of money. I don't even know how's that, the friend wondered. Don't you have a common budget or something? Yes, common. Thomas gives for the household, for my personal expenses too. Otherwise, I didn't feel comfortable asking. All right, you'll figure it out, and it felt a little strange hearing that. But you decide to stay out of other people's lives. In principle, there was enough money in the family, and everything was fine. Lydia was with her granddaughter during the day, and Elizabeth came home from work in the evening. Mama! Katie shouted joyfully and ran to the girl, and Elizabeth loved the girl. My daughter, she laughed and held Katie close to her. Then Thomas would come home from work, and they would all get together for dinner, a real tight-knit family. Lydia rejoiced. At last, her son had found a worthy wife. A year went by. Elizabeth was already seriously thinking that it was time for her and Thomas to have a child together. She told her husband about it. Elizabeth, it's bad timing, he grieved his wife. I'm having difficulties at work, and having another child is an extra expense. Can't we wait another 6 months? Okay, honey, Elizabeth agreed. A few days after this conversation, there was a knock on their door. It was their day off. Elizabeth was in the kitchen, and Katie was helping her mother. Thomas opened the doors. She shouted to her husband, "On my way," he replied. Did someone want to come over for pie? Then Elizabeth heard Thomas shriek in surprise in the hallway. That's what was at the door, he said confusedly and pointed to the large basket he was clutching tightly in his hands. What's the present in there? Smiled Elizabeth and peered into the basket. The smile immediately evaporated from her face, then the girl was as surprised as her husband. There were 2 babies in the basket. The babies were sound asleep, even smiling in their sleep. On top of the blanket they were covered with was a note. Thomas read it, frowned, and handed the note to his wife. Thomas, forgive me for this act, but I have no one else to turn to, was written in flat handwriting on a piece of notebook paper. I have a difficult situation in my life. I need to go abroad urgently. I cannot take my children with me. I know that you will definitely respond to my request. Please let my children stay with you for 6 months. I will pick them up later. Evelyn. She's got some nerve, exclaimed Thomas angrily. Is she going to give me her babies like kittens every year now? My God, they're so cute, Elizabeth sighed as she looked at the babies. How old are they? 1 month at a time, Thomas answered glumly, examining the children's birth certificates which were also in the basket, and added, boys. There's a dash in the father's column. Where should we put them? We should call the police. Wait, the police, Elizabeth stopped him. We have to change them, they're already moving, they're hungry now. We've got to get them some food. Run to the drugstore. Elizabeth, what are you talking about? Thomas exclaimed. His voice made the baby shudder, open their eyes, and cry. Why do we need other people's children? They're babies, Elizabeth replied. A kitten or a puppy is pathetic, and here are babies like that. All the while, Katie stood next to the basket, looking at the twins. Little ones, the girl said affectionately, stroking the babies' heads. Elizabeth took the babies out of the basket and changed them. The babies calmed down a bit. While Thomas went to the drugstore, one thought kept bothering Elizabeth. Should she report them to the police or keep the babies? On the one hand, it was absurd. One kid, there were three, and Katie was Thomas's daughter. And these kids had nothing to do with their family. On the other hand, she grew up in an orphanage. She knows it's a nightmare. All bought, Thomas said irritably and slammed the front door. Hush, you, Elizabeth answered him. The little ones have only calmed down a little. Elizabeth, stop coddling them like that. Thomas was furious. I'll take them to the police now. Let them deal with it. Wait, calm down. I'll feed them first, Elizabeth replied calmly as she prepared baby formula. It's good for you to reason. You're not the one who just got dropped off two kids by a stranger. What am I? A virtue, Elizabeth. We're family, Elizabeth reminded him, and we're going to solve this problem together. I'm working too. Elizabeth herself was at a loss. For the evening, she nursed the babies and watched Katie rejoice in the twins. When the children were asleep, she decided to talk to Thomas. Let's keep them, she said firmly to her husband. I'll take care of them. You see, it's a pity for them. They're only just coming into the world, and no one wants them anymore, just like I did. Elizabeth, that's a lot of money to spend on all of them, sighed Thomas heavily. And I want a new car. And we'll buy it, Elizabeth urged him. We'll register the kids in our names. We'll be a large family. There's all sorts of benefits. Why talk about money? They're children. They need care. Look how happy Katie is about them. Our daughter would be upset if we put them in an orphanage. Let's keep them for a while. Thomas agreed. After all the formalities, the babies became full members of their family. They were so peaceful, but Elizabeth had to quit her job to take care of the babies all day long. Evelyn, of course, never came back for the babies. There were 3 children in the house forever: laundry, feedings, walks. By evening, Elizabeth was very tired, and Thomas was increasingly late at work, and then several times he didn't come home at all. Elizabeth suspected betrayal. One day, she checked his phone and saw correspondence with another girl. Elizabeth realized her husband was having an affair. She was so hurt. I take care of the kids all day long, and you go out, she would say to her husband. What did you want? Thomas grumbled. I'm a normal man. I need a woman's affection. What about you? Have you looked at yourself in the mirror lately? No hair, no makeup, always in your home clothes. I don't have the time, Elizabeth replied grudgingly. Mind you, it wasn't my ex-boyfriend who gave me the kids, it was your wife. Maybe this one, your next one, will bring us a present too. You wanted it yourself, Thomas replied. But after these conversations, he stopped staying late at work. At least, Elizabeth didn't notice anything. Lydia was often at their house. Of course, she paid more attention to Katie, but she didn't hurt the twins either. Children, what was their fault? Just saying what a load her little boys got on him, Lydia. But why the load? Elizabeth tried to persuade her. The children are good, quiet, healthy, there's no problem with them. Little kids cause little trouble, the mother-in-law answered, and when they grow up, we'll raise them. Elizabeth replied confidently, we'll also have a baby together, just as long as these ones grow up a little. Well, okay, if so, Lydia answered doubtfully. And then disaster struck. Katie got sick, and so badly that she had to take a lot of tests and go to hospitals. There was a suspicion of a genetic disease, and then it turned out that Thomas was not the girl's biological father. The man was in shock. Fortunately, the doctor's suspicions were not justified, and Katie soon recovered. And while she was in the hospital, there was a scandal in the house. Thomas decided he no longer intended to raise other people's children. I really am an idiot, he shouted angrily, and it's your fault too. Allegedly, I feel sorry for the children. That's enough. I'll go to the guardianship office tomorrow and write a statement. Let them take all 3 of them to the orphanage. And Katie? Elizabeth was shocked. You've been raising her since birth. And I almost raised these two from birth, too. Thomas was angry, but that doesn't make them any closer to me, understand? I want to raise my own children. Lydia was at her son's house at the same time. She didn't say anything, just averting her eyes from her daughter-in-law. She felt more sorry for her son. Elizabeth gathered her things, dressed the boys, and called a cab. She had nowhere else to go, only Emma could shelter her. What else could it be, friend? Replied Emma when Elizabeth opened her door and told her, "Come in and live with me. I've got one room available, and I'll make room for the kids. Sometime." "Thank you, Emma, it's nothing." Emma had already picked up one of the babies, grabbed her bag, and headed for the room. "You'll see, things will get better." Elizabeth took Katie from the hospital to her new apartment. The girl couldn't figure out where her daddy and grandmother were. They went far away, Elizabeth lied, and it was alive for good. How can you explain to a little man that he was betrayed at one moment by the people closest to him? A year went by. Elizabeth was able to get the twins and Katie into kindergarten, and Elizabeth herself worked at the cafe as a waitress. She was grateful to Emma. Life went on. Thomas, as promised, did not pay the children anything after the divorce. Lydia had forgotten all about her granddaughter in an instant, but Elizabeth decided she could do it anyway, and she could raise her children. One day, Elizabeth noticed a homeless man outside a cafe. He was still a young man, but it was obvious that his life had taken its toll. He was sitting on a bench and looked dejectedly at the satisfied, well-fed people coming out of the cafe. This place smelled so good. The man occasionally swallowed hungry saliva, and Elizabeth couldn't look at it anymore. She ran into the kitchen and asked the cook for a couple of meatballs, some potatoes, some buns, and got some tea. "Eat," she said to the man. He looked at the girl in surprise. He was already unaccustomed to normal human companionship. Everyone around him treated him with disgust. He was such a beautiful girl handing out food and smiling. "Thank you," he whispered and began greedily gulping down the food. Elizabeth left so as not to embarrass him. Then, regularly, she began to feed him. They got to know each other. Elizabeth learned a shocking story. A few years ago, Daniel was a successful doctor practicing chiropractics with a family. And one day, as his daughter and wife were driving to his house in a cab to celebrate their wedding anniversary, there was an accident. The daughter was killed instantly. His wife was on a ventilator for 24 hours and died as well, bearing his beloved girls. Daniel began to bury his grief with alcohol. He lost his job, and then foreclosure took away his apartment. He became an unneeded man. Friends betrayed him, relatives pretended they never knew him. So he wandered around basements and back alleys, hungry and dirty, only occasionally managing to earn a little money. Daniel decided that his life had lost its meaning, and he even considered stepping under a car at one point or jumping off a bridge. And the girl at the cafe offered to help. Daniel suddenly realized that not the whole world was against him. Maybe things would change. Elizabeth felt so sorry for him. By then, she was able to rent an apartment. Emma, of course, was not against their presence, but she had her own personal life. So, one day, when the children were in kindergarten, Elizabeth invited Daniel to her place to wash and clean up. He refused at first, but Elizabeth was persistent. After the baths, he came out a completely different man. He was handsome, slightly older than Elizabeth. Yes, life had taken its toll on him, but that was okay. That day, they sat for a long time talking. Suddenly, the girl offered him to stay with her. "I have 3 children, you look after them while I'm at work. It's very hard for me to bring them up alone. In the evenings, I rush to the kindergarten, then home, laundry, cooking." "Sir, are you okay with that?" "Aren't you afraid to let a stranger into the house?" asked Daniel. I can see that you were a good man, Elizabeth smiled. So, they started living together, and 6 months later, they started a relationship. The children fell in love with Daniel very soon. They began to call him Daddy. The man was able to recover at the clinic. Then one day, Daniel was found by his former patient's father. Somehow, with the help of massage, he literally put a young boy on his feet, saved him from disability. They met by chance at the clinic. Daniel, by the way, worked there again, thanks to the efforts of Elizabeth. The rich man was very happy to meet the savior of his son. He knew of Daniel's distress, knew of his plight, and the fact that he had been homeless for several years. As a thank you, he transferred a large sum of money to Daniel's account. He couldn't do it before. Daniel had disappeared very quickly after the tragedy. Now, they hugged like old friends and wished each other good luck. Daniel used the money to open a private clinic, and Elizabeth was pregnant by then, a fourth child for Elizabeth. So exciting. She was raising 3, and she had never given birth herself. It was scary, but there was support, her family. So, 10 years went by. The Daniel Clinic was one of the best in town. Elizabeth had long had her own cafe, where Emma was the manager. The children were growing up. One day, Elizabeth saw an amazing couple walk into their cafe, a woman overweight and next to her, a thin, tall man. The woman was clearly older. She looked rich. "Honey, are you comfortable?" the man asked, motioning her. "Twitch her, honey, aren't you stuffy? What can I get you?" "Thomas, but you know," she answered irritably, "freshly squeezed orange juice, waiter." The man literally jumped up from his seat to quickly place his order. And then, Elizabeth recognized him. It was amazing how much he had changed. Thomas, her first love, thinner, graying hair, and how ridiculously he runs around this lady. Where's that handsome, statuesque fellow now? He looks more like an elderly footman. He recognized her too. Elizabeth could tell by a surprised look. She was sitting at the bar next to the bartender, and then Thomas's friend had gone somewhere urgent. Thomas walked over to the bar. "Hello," he said to Elizabeth, "you've changed, you look prettier. Are you working here? How are you, anyway? This is my cafe." Elizabeth smiled. "The kids are growing up. Husband's a famous doctor. We're doing well. How about you? Married recently?" He sighed heavily. "She's a good one. Don't look at her if she's grumpy, I see." Elizabeth smiled. "I'm so sorry. I have to go pick up the kids from soccer practice. My sons are playing soccer. The coach is praising them." "Sure, go," he nodded sadly. He wanted to say something else, but he didn't. There, he just stared after Elizabeth, beautiful, young, successful, and she had once been his wife. Too bad, nothing could be undone. Thank you for joining us today on Deep Stories. Be sure to like and subscribe and hit that notification bell so you don't miss out on our next video.